Finally, Sowore has been granted bail. So many people have been talking about this. So many people have been mouthing off on the issue, saying all sorts of things. So what I will be doing today is just trying to give you the facts and making sure that you understand what really happened. And we're going to be touching on some of the things that happened before the bail was granted from the custody of the government and all sorts of things like that. So I just want us to be able to get the facts straight so that we don't go into the territory of fake news and things like that, as those things are very common these days. So yesterday the trial was held and presided over by Justice Ijeoma Ojukwu at the Federal High Court at Abuja. Now, one thing that's very important for everyone to know about this is that the trial is not yet over. It's not yet over. It was only adjourned. Sowore's case has not been completed. It was only adjourned. It has not been completed. So for people that are already rejoicing and saying all sorts of things like, oh yes, they already got the victory, it's not exactly that. There are still so many things to go on. The case has not been completely litigated. So I'm just trying to make that clear to everybody before we begin with the facts. So now, of course, we know that Sowore's lawyer is Mr. Femi Falana, SAN, of course. Now, one of the things that he said about the bail condition yesterday was that the bail condition was too stringent, just too harsh, like almost as if they really didn't want to release him, so they decided to give a whole lot of conditions that they felt that he might not be able to meet up with. So that's the sentiment that Sowore's lawyer actually has concerning the bail term. So now, what are the bail conditions given to Sowore? What are the bail conditions? On what terms was he granted bail? Now again, remember, the case has not been finished. It's not like maybe it's not going to come back to court some other day. It's still going to come back to court. They're still going to litigate the whole issue, and it's just not over. So this bail is just to grant him sort of temporary freedom in the meantime before the next day of the adjudication in the court. So that's the reason why they're granting him bail so that he can go home, refresh. Then whenever he has trial, he can come back to court. So he doesn't have to be held in detention of the DSS for a prolonged time or continually until the day of his trial. So that's it. We all understand that there was a time that a Federal High Court judge or justice actually gave a directive that he should be released. That was after he was so there was actually a Federal High Court and so there was actually a Federal High Court Justice Taiwo that asked him to be released a few weeks ago, but that didn't happen until this particular court adjudication came up, in which he has now been granted the bail we're talking about. Now, the Sowore's bail conditions, the first one is that he's going to have to pay 100 million naira for the bail condition, and then he needs to have two people on ground who are going to be like the guarantors or like the sureties for him. And each one of those sureties must have properties worth at least 100 million naira on ground in Abuja. That is, you must have properties, whether it's land or buildings or things like that, businesses in Abuja that are worth up to 100 million naira. Those are those people that would qualify to be sureties for Sowore's bail. And they, of course, have to deposit at least 50 million naira to the court account before he can be released, which means he's not going to be released immediately. Of course, he was not released immediately yesterday. That has to be covered. These conditions have to be covered before he will be released for him to go home. Then, of course, each surety, again, I've already said that they must have at least 100 million worth of properties right there in Abuja. And then the sureties must be residents in Abuja. That is, they must be Abuja residents, not people from other places that own properties in Abuja. They must actually be involved in Abuja. They live in Abuja. Then each surety must provide evidence to court showing clearance of their taxes for 2016, 2017, and 2018. That means that they are trying to ensure that those people who are going to stand as sureties for Sowore must be those that have cleared their federal taxes. That is, they have actually paid their taxes, not people that have been evading taxes and things like that. They want to be assured that these people that are going to be standing in for Sowore, or at least helping him out, actually are not having any sort of issues with the federal government on the issues of taxes. So that's for that. At least 3 years fully paid, 2016, 2017, and 2018. So they must be able to provide a sort of affidavit to show that they actually did that. They have a sort of confirmation that they pay their taxes before they can opt in to help Sowore out on this issue. Now, they also must Sowore must submit his traveling documents to the court, because I think they believe that he's at flight risk, that he might escape the country and run over to somewhere else, kind of like what Nnamdi Kanu did. Of course, this situation is not exactly the same with Nnamdi Kanu. There are differences, but that's the case. They don't want him to escape from the country. So that's the reason why they're saying, okay, submit all your documents before you can be granted bail, so that we don't grant you bail at the end of the day, you escape from the country and start mouthing off from outside the country and inciting people. So that's what the government believes, and that's what they have already done. Now, Sowore cannot leave Abuja throughout the trial period. That's another condition that is on ground, which means even though he's going to be granted bail, he has to remain within Abuja. He cannot leave Abuja. So he has to commit to that promise that he's not going to leave Abuja no matter what. So which means it's almost like he's confined within Abuja. So he cannot do anything. Whatever he wants to do in between trials, he has to be within Abuja. Then Sowore is barred from addressing any gathering throughout his trial period, which means he's not going to be able to address his people. He's not going to be address the people in his movement, the Revolution Now movement. He's not going to be able to speak with any one of them. He's not going to be able to, at least not as a crowd. He's not going to be able to speak with the crowd. He's not going to be able to address the movement directly. So those are one of the things there. So they don't want him to go out there and sort of incite his people or get them riled up a little more on the issue. So they want his movement to sort of dwindle down and go down, lose steam and become weaker. So I guess that's one of the reasons why they're doing that. So while he's going through his court litigation, he's not permitted to do any of those things or any of his activist activities. Now, Sowore's surety must deposit the document to the property that is going to be using as a sort of that is going to be using in supporting Sowore and showing that, okay, if anything happens, he's going to stand, he's going to be held responsible legally if Sowore defaults on his condition of bail. So that's what the surety has to do, which means the property. So if you are going to stand in for Sowore with maybe your hotel or something like that, you have to turn in the documents of ownership of your hotel to the government, to the court, so that in case of anything, they have something to stand in for the bail, no matter what the situation may be. So if Sowore should default on his bail terms, you will be the one held responsible for it. So that's one of the conditions. Now, Sowore's accomplice, okay, I guess I should not call him accomplice, partner, Bakare, the bail condition for the other guy, that's Bakare, is that he should submit his own traveling documents, kind of like Sowore's issue also, submit his traveling documents to the court as well. Then he's barred from addressing any gathering, exactly the same thing given to Sowore. He's not allowed to make any sort of public speaking or to address his people and things like that, or to incite them for any reason whatsoever. He's completely barred from doing that. Then he cannot leave Osun State, where he's living, apart from when he's going for trial in Abuja. So it's like, Bakare is permitted to leave Abuja to return to where he stays, where he resides in Osun State, but he's not permitted to leave Osun State. So he's confined, very similar to what Sowore is going through. He is confined within his own state, apart from the dates on which he has trials in Abuja. So anytime there is a court trial or he has to go back for the case, he can go to Abuja. So the only place he's allowed to go, apart from remaining in Osun State, is to go to Abuja for his trial. Apart from that, he's to be confined within Osun State. So that's for him. And of course, like I said, he's not permitted to leave the country, so his traveling documents have been confiscated. Then, we now move over to the complaints of Sowore's lawyer. Now, Sowore's lawyer has been claiming that the Revolution Now movement, and especially the government seizing on the revolution part of the movement, is not genuine, or that is disingenuous. That the government seizing on that is just a pretext for them to oppress Sowore, or is a pretext for them to clamp down or to clamp down on freedom of speech, to clamp down on things like that, to clamp down on human rights, to clamp down on the ability of the citizens to be able to protest their government. That is what they are just trying to do. They're trying to prevent him from being able to protest the government and being able to ask what they want from the government. That's basically what they're trying to do. That it's not about the revolution as the word itself. He claims that the word revolution is not stated by the Nigerian law or the Nigerian constitution to be a crime. That the revolution by itself, in and of itself, is not a crime. So why would they hold on to that and latch on to that word revolution as a way to keep him, and saying that he's trying to incite a sort of revolution or to spur up a sort of popular uprising within the country? So that's what they have been claiming, that's what the government is claiming. That so now Sowore's lawyer is claiming that, okay, this is very, very disingenuous of you guys. You know this is not a violation of the law. Claiming or clamoring for revolution, or saying revolution in and of itself, is not in and of itself a crime in the Nigerian constitution. So now that's the first case that he's making, and he's using that as a sort of attack against the government, that you are just latching on to that word. Then he mentions Buhari's call for Egypt-style revolution in 2011. So what he's saying is that back in 2011 election, that Buhari actually called for a sort of revolution, I guess, in his contest against Goodluck, that he mentioned that Nigeria would need a sort of revolution as the style that Egypt got in the Arab Spring, where they overthrew the government in Egypt, especially the ruler of Egypt that had been there for, I think, decades, where they got rid of him. That kind of system, that Nigeria needed that kind of system. So now he's quoting and saying that Buhari said that, called for that back in 2011, and he was not arrested because of that. The government of that day did not arrest him because of that. So why is he clamping down on somebody mentioning that at this time? Why is he clamping down on somebody mentioning that? And there's a sort of parallel between Sowore and Buhari back then. Sowore and Buhari now, and Buhari back then, and Goodluck. Goodluck saw Buhari back then as a sort of political antagonist, as a sort of political opponent. Now Sowore was the political opponent of Buhari. So there's a sort of parallel in that kind of dynamic, that, okay, the reason why he's clamping down on him is because he believes that he's trying to take over the government, or not just that, only because he is a political opponent to him. So it's like he's trying to take over his position, that kind of stuff. Now that's what the lawyer for Sowore has been claiming. That's Mr. Femi Falanan. That's what he has been claiming. Now, the last thing he also said is that he also mentioned was that even after that, one of the problems that government has, that, and why they can't just trust the government and we can't just say that the government is acting in good faith, is that back when the Justice Taiwo actually said that Sowore should be released after the time that he actually complied with the court order that he should submit his traveling documents and whatever, that after that the government still refused to release him, that the DSS still refused to release him, that how can you be sure that the government is going to fulfill their responsibilities or their own part of this kind of bargain? Apart from that it's not like maybe the government is just trying to do all these things they are doing as a form of trying to protect the country or trying to protect the administration solely, but it's also because they are just acting in bad faith, that the government is acting in bad faith, that you cannot trust the government from what they are saying. Again, referring back to the 2011 issue that he's talking about with Buhari, that it's a sort of disingenuous sort of argument, and it's very weak, and it's hypocritical. So that's his whole case. That's the case of the lawyer for Sowore, that it's all a farce. This whole thing is just a charade. It's completely a farce. There's no substance to it. Now, what is the case of the government? Now, for some people that don't really understand what has been happening, the dynamics between Sowore and the government. Now, the case for the government is that this guy has been calling for revolution. This guy has been asking that there should be revolution in Nigeria, revolution now, revolution now, revolution now. Now, I just wanted to look at a particular video of the Sowore the movement protesting. So, take a look at that. All right. Now, if you check that, you will see that they are actually shouting and calling for revolution, and then also calling for a social revolution in the country. That is the way to go. That is the way to go. Now, the case for the government is that, okay, these people are shouting for revolution. And what does revolution mean? Revolution means, it almost literally, revolution actually means, especially in the political context, according to the government, would mean an overthrow of the government. Like an overthrow of the government. That is the case of the government, that if you are to look at different revolutions around the world in history, it has always amounted to an overthrow of the revolution, from the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the whole sorts of revolution like that. That if you are to check all those kind of revolutions, you will see that most of the times, in fact, the majority of the times, it usually ends up in the removal of the government in charge whenever there is a popular uprising or a revolution. Another aspect of that can be seen in the Arab Spring in Libya, in Egypt, and in Yemen, and the rest of that. In Syria. And one of the things they're talking about is that it can also lead to war. So, and I'm still going to be talking on that, but one of the things I also want to mention, I'm still going to be talking on that. Now, which aspect, I just want us to think about this, which aspect or whose side or whose argument seems to be right in this kind of situation? The Sowore people saying that, okay, the revolution does not mean that they are trying to remove the government. It just means they want a drastic change in the way the country is being ruled, and in the way the government is treating the masses, and in the sort of entitlements that the masses have out of the government, and to eradicate corruption and things like that. That's what they mean by the revolution. That it's not about trying to remove the government or trying to destabilize the state or things like that. That they are not looking for sort of violence. They're not looking for violence. They're not looking for sort of war. Now that is the case for the Sowore movement. Now, so I'm going to be showing us another video. Let's see how strong this case for the Sowore movement is, and then we'll see how strong the case for the government is. So we're going to be contrasting those things. So now, for the Sowore's case, let's check another video and see it's actually Sowore and some other people on a panel discussing the case of a revolution, or the case for revolution. So let's see what they are saying.
What are the objective conditions that make people revolt? Right. Because revolution comes from people revolting.
Absolutely.
You know, have we all agreed that all the objective conditions are in place? Hunger, poverty, frustration, all of them are, loading high. Yeah. And the last thing is for people to shake off their complacency. And somehow, what he's referring to complicity. Complicity is that, anytime there's an opportunity, go and meet the people who are in charge, collect money from them, come and sabotage. I may disagree with you that there won't be spontaneous. For revolutions to be effective, they have to be spontaneous.
I think that's what
but I think, what I mean spontaneous is that the people against whom we are revolting must be in a comfortable position to say it can never happen. It happened in Cuba. They were still drinking, cognac. And before saying, look, is it not a bunch of when it happened in Sudan, they were making fun of the ladies who started it on the street corners, like it's women, and then one day from 5,000 it became 500,000, and before you could say Jack Robinson, these guys are out of power. But the last thing I want to say before you jump in is that you don't just plan revolutions, you also plan the micromanaging of the outcome of the otherwise, the same set of people...
That's the point I was trying to make.
I'll make that point for you. I'll make that point for you.
What I was even going to say is I saw your interview with Plus TV, interesting, and when you refer to the revolution, you talked about basically, there was a particular word you used, which I forget, is it breaking down the structure totally, or something to that effect. And I think that's, for me, when people talk about a revolution, they do talk about it in that way, and it's that explosive way that everybody talks about. For me, I think we need to look at it with a more pragmatic, implementable and practicable approach, because look, when you're breaking down systems, you're looking, often when people talk about revolution in Nigeria, they're talking about a revolution against the elite. Stop focusing on the elite and talk about a revolution that's nuanced to the masses. If you have a revolution that's nuanced to the masses, then you work from the outside in. And what do I mean by that? Basically, a revolution can happen in several different ways. Like, was it you or Mecca that was saying last time that people are always afraid of restructuring, that word? Well, you can do restructuring in a gazillion of ways. So for me, what I would say is, if you work at it from the outside ways, first of all, look at the keystones of a society, women and children, right? So create those marketplaces, give them grants, not loans, so you empower from the outside. Also, start employing students straight from university, graduate recruitment. Don't wait for them to get on the streets. You look at the healthcare.
I understand what you're saying, but there's also a concept or a dimension to this that I'm seeing as a trend, which is analysis paralysis.
No, I'm not analyzing. It's
practicable. To the problem to the point that.
But what I'm saying is practicable.
But the thing is that
actually practicable.
The thing is that there's none of these things that we haven't tried.
You haven't tried direct.
Trader money was their own response to
forget trader money. Put that one. Put that one aside. Let me put it to you.
But
you have not tried. Look, in the old days, right? Our fathers will tell you, I was recruited directly from university. They had graduate recruitment. So you haven't tried that. That's number one. Number two,
the point is,
let me comment.
The status quo.
Everything
the status quo is not creating these things. The status quo cannot solve the problem.
Let me just try.
Let her land, because I want to make a point.
Everything that's being done right now. Notice I said it has to be done from the outside in. Everything that's been done right now is often done from the inside out, from the center. I'm saying start from the conundrums, the rural areas. No, to the rural areas, to the masses. Okay. Because if you're focused, there's no point of a revolution if you're not nuanced.
Okay, let me make this point. Sorry, let me make this point.
So make your point.
So I'll make my point because I know you want to come back on that. Just make a note of it. I was wanting to follow up on the point he raised. Well, I wanted to make it, but he started saying it, which is my issue, and that's why I want there to be an element of planning in any kind of change people envisage. Is that all the revolutions I've looked at, usually the people who come to save end up becoming worse than the people they were displacing. So the reason being that whole mentality of this thing can't exist outside of me, and the power corrupts gets into their heads. If you look at Mugabe and all these people, what's the guy in Cuba? What's his name? Castro. And various other people like that.
Rwanda is not far from it.
And you know that we're still in that place where somehow we're immature as leaders. We don't seem to understand accountability. Delegating power. So we need to make sure that if there's any point in doing a revolution, those things need to be implemented.
Exactly, but we don't need to draw parallels that drown us. You understand?
Which is
the assumption is that there are no good Nigerians.
No, there are.
No, that's what I'm saying.
No, who can?
But they need a system that restrains those impulses.
I don't want a revolution that's led by people who are at the center. I want if you care about me as a Nigerian, irrespective of the fact that I'm middle class, I want you to start from my brothers and sisters who do not get a full day's meal.
Yes.
Then I will be.
I think there are 2 points. There's a conflation. There are 2 different things.
Not you.
No, but
let him make his point.
Even at my level, sometimes I feel too comfortable to want to take risk. Revolution involves taking risk. You are talking from a point of view of what they call, enlightened self-interest. You are saying that the revolution must happen from the village. Which revolution ever happened from a village?
Oh my God! That's because you're not being
It happens in the city. It happens in the city.
Yes.
There's no revolution rate.
There's no revolution
that happens from the village.
That's what I like.
I've never seen it.
It has to happen where it has
city. Where it has to
Look, you've all done it. You've all been going on about this this revolution, right? And I'm saying to you, what are you talking about? Forget whether you're going to have bloodshed. You're talking about a financial, economical, structure, human, and revolution of the humanity. Self-worth.
It is said that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. Economics light of the challenges ahead of us after the break.
Okay, going through that clip, there are a couple of things that would jump out at you. Now, there are points for both sides in this video. Now, in the favor of the Sowore movement, in the favor of the revolution movement, now, in the video, if you really look very deeply, you are going to be able to see that they talk about change of societal systems, especially massive graduate recruitment. And the woman in Ankara mentioned that massive graduate recruitment and development of human capital and the disadvantaged individuals in the country. So those people that have always been neglected in the country, they're trying to bring them into the system and make sure that these people benefit from the product, from the goodness, from the dividends of the society, and making sure that these people are included in the society and are included in the social benefits of the society. So you can really read what they're talking about and see this out of that. You can read this into what they're talking about, the whole revolution issue. You can read this out of that. Now, which is very, very generous way to view things. For most people, it's actually a very generous way to view it if you are viewing it from this aspect. But it's very plausible that this might be what they are looking at, and this might be what they are aiming to achieve. Now, the second one, which is on the government side, the way the government is going to read this kind of a video or see this kind of video is that first it mentions revolution, and out of those revolutions, it mentions a lot of examples of revolutions. It mentioned the example of the Cuban Revolution. Now, I'm going to be explaining those things. It mentioned the example of the Cuban Revolution, the Sudanese Revolution. You see? Now, what happened in the Cuban Revolution? In the Cuban Revolution, what happened back then, back in the late 50s, was when Fidel Castro, a revolutionary, that was leading a group of revolutionaries, took over, that is, seized power from Batista. Batista was the leader of Cuba back then, and he had the backing of the United States back then, because Cuba is actually about 90 miles from Miami, about 90 miles from the United States. So it's a very close country to the United States. So United States had a lot of influence on what was going on there. So Batista was a sanctioned, United States sanctioned government in charge of Cuba back then. So what made them to revolt was actually because, there was hunger, there was all sort of terrible situation, similar to one of the things going on in Nigeria. Although I don't think Nigerian condition was as serious or is as serious right now as the Cuban situation was back then in the 1950s. So a group of revolutionaries led by Fidel Castro took over the government, and it was very, very serious situation, but it involved the use of an issue of force and arms and sort of violence. It was violent revolution. The same thing going over to the Sudanese Revolution. Of course, you know the Sudanese Revolution, which later led into the breakdown of Sudan and Southern Sudan, and which of course is still causing a lot of trouble in Southern Sudan till now. So, it involves a whole lot of violence. That's the examples they gave. Now, I'm going to be mentioning a couple of other examples in the revolution. What happened in the French Revolution? The French Revolution was when King Louis XVI, which was the king of France back then, he was in charge, and situation was going very terribly. Everything was very horrible. The king actually married the princess from Austria. It was a sort of political marriage in order to create sort of peace, and she was like the peace treaty between France and Austria in order to end decades old sort of war between those two nations. Now, that was Maria Antoinette. Now, what really happened was that the nobles, that is the kings, the henchmen of the king, so many people around the king, the aristocrats, they were living in all sorts, because they were the one that owned the land. They were in charge of land and properties, generally speaking. They were the landlords. So they were controlling all sorts of things in the nation, and they were getting a lot rich while the people were getting very poor. And then added to the fact that they had a sort of farming at that period, and there was a population explosion before that time. So there were so many people to be fed, and there wasn't enough food. And of course, King Louis XVI's palace is very far away from the capital, about 12 miles away, if not even more than that, from the capital, which means he was not even seeing the plight of his people. So he didn't care about his people. They were just living lives of luxury in his palace. That was the palace of Versailles. They were just living lives of luxury and everything. Everybody was being all great, while the peasants were suffering in Paris and other parts of the country. They were suffering. Buying bread became a problem. Prices of bread increased tremendously. I think over 200% at a very short period. So life was becoming very uncomfortable for the normal people, for the regular people outside, for the peasants. It was very, very uncomfortable. And then, because the king was not being very responsive and things like that, and of course when they were trying to resolve the whole issue, it was as if the government, that was the king and his people, they were trying to cheat the third estate, because France back then, they were divided into 3 estates: the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. The third estate was just the regular people, the peasants. The first estate, I think the first estate was the royalty. The second estate was the clergy. That was the Catholic Church, because predominantly France has always been Catholic. So then we now have the last estate, which was the estate of the regular people on the street. Now, what happened was that when they were making deliberations and trying to reform the government, which of course the people demanded for, and of course the king admitted to that, when they were trying to resolve all those issues, it was as if the government was trying to cheat out those people. They were supposed to make a sort of vote on what was going to happen, and suddenly they locked the door against the regular people, and then that led to the revolution, because it was as if, okay, these people are not going to listen to us, and Maximilian Robespierre and some of the other guys came together and they drafted a pseudo constitution for the nation, and on from that, people started getting attacked. So many violence started coming upon the nobles. The nobles got kicked out of power. I mean, at the end of the whole thing, the king got guillotined. That is, his head was chopped off with a specifically designed machine for that. 6 months later, his wife got guillotined, also killed. So they actually removed the whole government from power. And actually, that's one of the reasons why France does not have any sort of monarchy. And France has not been having any sort of monarchy since the time of the French Revolution, apart from the brief period when Napoleon, which was somehow part of the revolution, came into power in France and made himself sort of the emperor at the end of the day, when he had already conquered so many parts of Europe, kind of like Hitler conquered so many parts of Europe. Now, what I'm just trying to say is that it is very, very difficult to argue that revolutions don't involve violence at all. Now, there are some sort of revolutions that will involve violence and end up good, like the United States Revolution and the Revolutionary War, taking their independence from Britain, and now the United States is a country where they respect a whole lot of human rights, and they were not causing all sorts of trouble for people killing themselves or causing all sorts of issues for themselves. Now, that's a very good example, but out of all the examples, I think that's probably like the only one that's very, very peaceful, or as close as possible to positivity. I won't call it peaceful. Out of all sorts of revolution, the Russian Revolution led to so many people killed. The war led to communism taking over the whole of Russia. You know, exactly the same thing that happened to China in the Chinese Revolution, led to communism. In the great leap forward of communism, about 45 million people in China were killed or died from starvation because of the use of communism. And that's actually one of the things that's scaring me in this whole Sowore issue. Now, I don't have issues with some of the proposals they have. The proposals, no problem. The only issue is with this issue of social revolution, or the revolution generally speaking, is that some of the policies, of course I agree with most of the policies, but some of the policies look like socialist policies, which is very dangerous. Very, very dangerous. Socialism is a very, very bad thing. It looks, it's like a monster with a pretty face. It looks, I mean, the ideologies and everything looks so great, but if you implement it, it's always going to lead into horror. The same thing, check Venezuela. Socialism, very horrible. Now they have to go around eating rats from inside dumpsters and all sorts of things like that, and the government is oppressing them. And so it's exactly the same thing. If you are going to listen to the woman in white actually says that if you're not very careful, revolution might bring into power people that believe that they are the better people in the society, and at the end of the day, usually turn into worse people. She mentioned part of that as the Cuban Revolution, where Fidel Castro became almost like a tyrant, and became very, very vicious, more than the former government. Became very vicious, was able to crack down on any sort of people revolting. So now, because it's like, okay, the people that caused the revolution in the beginning, they know how they did it, so they are going to be more sensitive to anybody trying to bring up any sort of revolution if they are sort of not well satisfied by the new people in power. Of course, the people that took over from the former government. Now, if people are very dissatisfied with their own way of government, they know that they can get removed from government, so they clamp down on people more than the former government would have done, because they know how they got there was through revolution. So they are going to be more sensitive and more intolerant of any sign of revolution, more than the government that was there in the beginning. So that's what the woman is trying to say, that yes, it's good. How are we going to make sure that we get the right people in power? Which means they themselves, see, it's a sort of admission that in some vague way, maybe not completely, but at least in some vague ways, they are making some sort of suggestion that the revolution they're talking about has to do with changing government. Now, at least in the barest minimum, it has to do with some sort of change in the government, at least some sort of actual change in the people ruling, in the ruling class, and bringing in people that are supposed to be the revolutionaries that are bringing about the change into power. So what the only thing you're trying to argue about is, okay, how are we going to make sure that the right people get into power, not the wrong people that are going to become like people like Stalin in Russia, or Lenin, or like Fidel Castro, or any other guys like that, or like Kim Il's son, the grandfather of Kim Jong-un, or Chairman Mao in China. So that's the only thing you're trying to argue about. Now let's continue. Now they also mention the issue about leaders getting removed from power in Sudan, which means it's a sort of parallel. So they are mentioning leaders got removed in Sudan and using that as a sort of example of revolutions around the world, and using that as a sort of example on how they should carry out the revolution that they're talking about. Now, I'm not saying they're going to carry up arms and attack Sowore and attack everywhere and try to depose the government directly like the Bolsheviks did in Russia when they attacked the Winter Palace to remove the provisional government after the Tsar of Russia abdicated the throne in 1917. So now that's not what I'm saying exactly, but there seems, if you are to look deep enough and objectively enough, even though most people are in support of some of the policies, or at least most of the policies that Sowore is fighting for, equity and all sorts of things like that, it's true. End to corruption, it's true. But if you have to look at it very objectively, it's very, 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 very difficult for you to argue that the Sowore movement is not in some ways, no matter how little it may be, in some ways, that they are not in some ways talking about a change in government, talking about removal of the people in government. It's very, very difficult to argue that, coming from all these videos and some of the articles that they write. It's very, very difficult for you to argue that they are not in any way talking about removal of the current administration, or removal of government, or the overhauling of the entire government, or the overhaul of the entire government. So that's exactly what the government is talking about. Now, another one is that, the woman in Ankara also mentions the issue of breaking down of the system. Then the woman in white mentions the displacing of people in power. And so there are many parts of this whole discussion. Of course, this is not the only discussion that Sowore has had with his people. So yes, there are other videos where he might have clarified some things better, but I'm just trying to say that it's very, very difficult for you to look at this video or to watch this video and not have a sense that, okay, maybe, just maybe, you may be in support of that, but at least you should be honest enough with yourself to say, yeah, just maybe, the Sowore movement, that's the Revolution Now movement, is actually talking about actual revolution, not just some watched down revolution or diluted revolution or just normal social reforms or things like that. It's not about reforms, it's about revolution. They would have called it reform if it was about reform. It was not reform, it's not reform, it's revolution. They want the whole system. Revolution happens when you believe that the old system has failed and you need to overhaul everything and start from the beginning, or at least change everything up because you believe the old system is, if you're going to do reforms, okay, you believe the system is still all right and just trying to change some parts of the system, but you're not replacing the system, changing some parts of the system, make it up to date, things like that. But this is not reform, it's a revolution. They want to get rid of what is on ground and get a better system. At least that's what it looks like. That's what it looks like. That's what the government is going to say if they go through that. At least this video and many other articles by the Revolution Now issue. Then they also, at the very end, although this one can be read in different ways, they admit revolution might involve bloodshed in some ways, which shows that they understand that revolution could involve violence one way or the other. So it's easy. It's a sort of spin. It's a sort of it's some sort of a spin by Sowore and the others to say that this does not, that revolution that they're talking about does not necessarily involve removal of the government or things like, which is the very basis upon which the government is charging him with treasonous counts. That is the very basis. So I guess you can read it in different ways. One way to read it is that, yeah, the Sowore movement is just talking about changing the government, making sure the government is less corrupt and things like that. Yes, and also, which seems to be increasingly the way most people that are sincere with the whole issue are going to read it, is that it seems they really want a change in regime. They really want a change in regime. So that's what it is. And then finally, I'm going to be mentioning that for some other people, it's because I've already looked at it. Is Sowore really saying that it's possible? Let's agree that they really want a revolution. I mean, actual meaning of revolution. That's what they mean by what they have been saying. Another thing that just occurred to me is that perhaps they really want revolution and a change of government, and they really are saying it open, knowing that the government has the power to crack down on them or clamp down on them. They know that. But they said it intentionally, maybe because they're so brave or whatever. Or is it that it's sort of like a three-dimensional chess or something, where they are actually doing it as a way to spur up the government or to scare the government into taking real actions rather than actually taking over the government or things like that. Again, this is if you believe that they are actually interested in taking over the government. Now, two ways to read it again. One is that they actually want to take over the government. Another way is that maybe they're just trying to cause a popular uprising such that the government will have to acquiesce to the demands of the people, because they know there is it's like negotiating with people from the place of authority or from the place of power. If you're going to negotiate with people, you make sure that your stance is powerful enough. So I guess that's what they're trying to do. There's a lot of grassroots support for the movement. So it's almost like a sort of trying to bluff the government into doing what they are supposed to do, so that the government actually takes real action rather than just doing campaigns, which of course many people believe elections are always rigged and things like that, which means it does not really matter whoever is going to be on the ballot box. The people that are going to be elected are going to be elected. It doesn't really matter. So I guess that's the reason why they're doing this, that we agree, this person is already in power and it remains in power. So I guess the only way for us to treat this issue is to bluff about it and to talk about it, talk about revolution so hard that the government feels that it's like, these people are really interested in this and they might do something, and try to bluff the government into taking real actions to fix the social problems within the country. So that's the way I see it. So how do you guys think about it? Or what do you think about it? So whatever you think, drop that in the comments, and like the video, subscribe to the channel so you can always get new videos anytime we post a new one. And of course, click on the notification bell and share the video. Thank you very much, and see you guys next time.